well, I've never had a mic with the box on it.
Yeah, it's pretty official.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here with Matthew and I. So we'll get started. I brought my copy of the book because there are a couple moments in here that I really sort of hit me in the face when I read them. And I want to start off with this graph that's sort of close to the beginning, where you say, this is who we are, the richest country on earth with more poverty than any other advanced democracy. If America's poor founded a country, that country would have a bigger population than Australia or Venezuela. Almost 1 in 9 Americans, including 1 in 8 children, live in poverty. There are more than 38 million people living in the US who cannot afford basic necessities, and more than 108 million getting by on $55,000 a year or less, many stuck in that space between poverty and security. So that was an eye-opener, and before we start, I want to make sure that everyone here is on the same page. So I'd love for you to give us just a quick, clear definition of poverty, because it's been tracked in different ways, and there's been heated debate on the ways in which we measure it. So what would you say is the best way to assess whether someone is experiencing poverty?
I'm so thrilled to be in conversation with you today. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all so much for coming out on such a glorious Chicago day. It's brilliant to be back in Chicago. Officially, poverty is a line. It's measured at an income level. If you make under $27,000 a year and you're in a family of 4, you're officially poor. There's other lines. So there's a line called the supplemental poverty measure, for example, that accounts for government aid, but it also accounts for living expenses and healthcare costs. And when the census rolled that measure out in 2011, the country officially gained 4 million more poor people, actually, because any reductions of poverty by counting things like food stamps and housing assistance were more than offset by looking at rising healthcare and housing costs. But this is just a start. Right? This is just the oil on the surface, as a poet, Layla Long Soldier, once wrote. You know, poverty is like chronic pain on top of tooth rot, on top of eviction, on top of your cousin getting roughed up by the cops, on top of not, having enough to eat for your kids. It's death come early and often. So far from a line, poverty is this tight knot of humiliations and agonies. And it is important to recognize, like you said in that first paragraph, that America has a lot more of it than other advanced democracies.
Yeah. So I want to start with where we are now, and then sort of work a little bit backwards and dig deeper into the issue. So according to the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University, 14.3% of Americans, that's nearly 50 million people, were living in poverty in December of 2022. We got new data out in September, just last month, from the US Census Bureau showing the poverty rate jumped about 13% last year, and it's hitting kids and older adults the hardest. When I think about this, the numbers make sense, right? We know that prices rose pretty sharply last year. We saw inflation sort of go up and ease a little bit, and I think it's most recent data show it's back up again. And we saw COVID-era federal aid programs, we saw those get scaled back last year as well. So put the number into context for us. How significant is a 12.4% jump in poverty in just 1 year?
It's significant, but because we had these massive reductions in poverty during COVID. So in COVID, there is this paradox where most Americans actually were more financially secure in the pandemic than before. And that was because the government released 3 huge relief packages, 2 under Trump and 1 under Biden. The Biden relief package was unique. It's called the American Rescue Plan, and it had something called the Extended Child Tax Credit. Normal child tax credit doesn't usually reach very poor families for wonky reasons we can get into if you all want to. So they just tweaked and adjusted the tax credit in small ways, but in doing so, they made it basically like a universal child allowance. So most middle class, working class, and poor families got help for their kids, an extensive amount of help. And that policy was responsible for reducing child poverty by 46% in 6 months during COVID. 46% decline in child poverty in 6 months. And so the jump we're seeing is a reversion to normal. It's a reset back to normal. I want to pause and say, this is heartbreaking, and this is on us. We were too quiet. We didn't call our congressperson. We didn't march in the streets. We didn't demand that being a new normal. And in our silence, 5 million more kids were cast back into poverty last year.
Correct. As I said, digging more into the data, you find children and people over 65 are the ones feeling the poverty increase disproportionately. When you think about that, what do you make of it?
The kids or the older Americans?
Both.
Well, on the kids front, like our child poverty rate is not just higher than other countries, it's double Germany's, South Korea's, Canada's. When I'm overseas, I often hear Europeans use the phrase American-style deprivation. So we've gotten used to just extremely high levels of child poverty over the years. What's happening with the rise of elderly poverty is interesting and it's unique because it used to be the case that growing old in America meant dying penniless. You know, this was the age before Social Security. And when Social Security came out, you just see these massive reductions in elderly poverty over the years. It was probably the most impactful anti-poverty program we have. But we see elderly poverty ticking up now. And so we should ask ourselves what's going on. And one of the things that's going on is that the young people who came of age during the prison boom and deindustrialization are not young anymore. They're reaching their silver years. And I think that Social Security isn't an insurance program. You got to qualify, right? You got to work enough. And if you're put away in a cage for long enough, or if jobs leave your community for long enough, you might be reaching your silver years not qualifying, and that has something to do with it.
So reverting back to your point before of how we saw fewer people in poverty while those benefits were still around, right? The COVID era federal benefits. Was that all it took? Was it just swift government action?
Yeah.
To see a reduction?
Yeah.
So that's all we need to do is just go back to that?
It's a huge part of it. I think that one of the resounding lessons from COVID is that swift, bold government programs work. And when Reagan said, we fought the war on poverty and poverty won, he was full of it then, and it's full of it now. You know, robust government action can make this huge difference. Now, this doesn't mean that these programs are perfect or it's all we need, but it's really hard to argue with the evidence. Look at what happened during evictions in COVID. Like, evictions were thrown to the lowest they've ever been on record, ever, because we rolled out something called the emergency rental assistance. You know, so this came after the moratorium, and it was $46 billion doled out to hurt and renting families. Now, it turns out you can't drop $46 billion out of a plane. And so we had to start these distribution channels. Some states were really good at that. Some states were terrible at it. And so the emergency rental assistance program, you remember this, right? When it came out, it was like bumbling, stuttering, and it wasn't reaching people. And everyone was talking about that and tweeting about that and writing about that and covering that. And then it did start reaching people. And then we were like, I just feel like we have to cultivate a language of celebration, and recognize, like, even when we don't get to the mountaintop.
Yeah. So there's a chapter in the book, it's called How We Rely on Welfare. And you write, the American government gives the most help to those who need it least. This is the true nature of our welfare state, and it has far-reaching implications, not only for our bank accounts and poverty levels, but also for our psychology and civic spirit. Then you go on to make this distinction between those who rely on visible social programs and those who rely on invisible ones. I'd love for you to explain the differences in the attitudes and behaviors that you see in those two groups of people.
So when we think about the welfare state, we usually think about Robert Taylor, right? Cabrini, food stamps, housing assistance, Medicaid. That's part of the welfare state. But so is like social insurance programs, like Social Security that many of us benefit. That's part of it too. But tax breaks are part of it too. And I know it's hard to recognize that sometimes, but like a tax break costs the government money, and a tax break puts money in my pocket. So if I own a home in Naperville and I get a mortgage, I can take a mortgage interest deduction. The government can execute that through the tax code or mail me a check every year. It's the same difference. So if we add all that up, everything the government does for us, and for me, this is like the one statistic that really blew me away researching this book. You learn that the average family in the bottom 20% of the distribution, our poorest families, they get about $26,000 a year from the government. But the average families in the top 20%, our richest families, they get about $35,000 a year from the government. It's almost a 40% difference. That's the true nature of our welfare state. And then we have like the audacity to like blame the poor for dependency. And when we look at the price tag of a program that would reduce child poverty or make sure all of us had access to a doctor, we're like, how can we afford it?
So entitlement comes into play.
Our entitlement. By our, I mean those of us that are pretty secure and privileged in America, yeah. And we often think of these benefits as invisible, right? And we don't think about them. But like once in a while, they do become very visible, like when people try to reform them, and we're like, no! And then they're like, well, they're not so invisible after all, are they?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is also why you say, poverty in America is not an accident. It's by design.
Yeah, I think that there's a line by Tommy Orange in the book, and he writes, kids are jumping out of the windows of burning buildings, falling to their deaths. And we think that the problem is that they're jumping. And when I read that, I was like, that's the American poverty debate. So much of our focus is on the poor themselves. It's been like that for over 100 years. We should have been focusing on the fire. Now, who lit it? Who's warming their hands by it? Now, some of us are warming our hands by it, and we don't even know it. And I think part of the work of this book is trying to show us how many of us are unwittingly implicated in this problem and in the solution.
Yeah. Your book isn't so much focused on the poor, rather on the rest of us. And I think we're getting the gist of that so far in this conversation. So say more. You've already given a few examples, but what is our collective responsibility? Like, what would you like to see from the rest of us?
Oh, I want to see us become poverty abolitionists. Yeah.
Clap it up for that, for sure. Define a poverty abolitionist in your view.
So like other abolitionist movements against slavery or the prison, poverty abolitionism views its problem as an abomination, like something that can't be tolerated. And like other abolitionist movements, poverty abolitionism recognizes that profiting from someone else's pain corrupts all of us. And so committing to this is a political project, but it's a personal one too. And those of us who accept this as who we are, we divest from poverty in our consumer choices and our investment decisions. We support a government actively trying to rebalance the safety net and deepen its investments in fighting poverty. We detest all forms of exploitation, even if we benefit from them. Mm-hmm. And we oppose segregation and opportunity hoarding and stand for prosperity. And overall, we commit ourselves to the idea that we should end poverty, end it. And we are bombastic and morally outrageous enough to make that claim.
Is that possible? Ending poverty?
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
It makes it sound easy.
Yeah, in this land of dollars, it is. When the Johnson administration launched the war on poverty in 1964, they set a deadline.
Yeah.
They set a deadline. They were like, by 1976, we got this. And we didn't get all the way there.
1976.
Yeah, they set a deadline. I just love that so much.
We are way off.
Yeah, but they cut poverty in half.
That hurts my heart as a journalist. I live by a deadline. So.
Yeah, right.
I'm like, oh my gosh.
I just think it wasn't talk for them, They were like, 1976. We used to have these ambitions to wipe out poverty. One way to address your question, too, is just to be like, well, what would it take? What would it take to bring everyone above the poverty line? So if you look at everyone below the poverty line and you just add up how much money it would take to lift them above it, it's about $177 billion a year, which is so attainable. Like, that's less than 1% of our GDP. Study a few years ago showed that if the top 1% of Americans just paid the taxes they owed,
Wow.
not paid more taxes, just if we collected their taxes, we could raise about $175 billion a year. So we could just about close the poverty gap if the richest among us just put in what they should. So yeah. I think it's utterly doable and attainable. And I think that one of the biggest myths about poverty today is that we have to live with so much of it.
It's such an intersectional problem,
Yeah,
poverty,
it is.
right? There are so many factors in people's lives that can lead someone or lead a family to, as you said, dip under the poverty line. In recent years, there are many folks who are working to address it, and they talk a lot about economic justice. Does that term mean something to you?
Yeah, but I wish it was like expressed in our everyday lives in a way that I feel it's not. Like a lot of us, like we know, like we get like our locally grown cucumber, you know, and we're like, this came from this farm down the road, and like, look at this. And we have no idea how much the farmhand got paid picking it, you know? Or like a lot of our stores have stickers on the doors, and we go in those doors because they have certain stickers, but we have like, there's one sticker we don't have, which is like, this store pays a living wage. And so I would love economic justice to be more part of how we live that out. I also think economic justice, like this, putting the emphasis on the justice really matters. So when we're talking about solutions to poverty, often we are talking about things like a universal basic income, something like that.
Yeah.
Give people money.
A lot of talk about that.
A lot of talk. So I've got some complicated feelings about UBI. And one of the feelings I have about it is like, part of the solution, I feel, has to be about the justice part, which means like ending exploitation in the labor market and the housing market and the financial markets. And so this means doing things like finding a way to empower workers, giving low-income families more choice in the rental market, and ending this kind of exhaustive, unrelenting exploitation by banks and other lending institutions. That's more of the justice part of it.
Okay.
Just in the, you know, and I think that's different and needs to be part of the menu of something that's about lifting floors.
Yeah, I mean, the basic concept, as I've known it, is just this notion that, you know, the economy will work better if the system is fairer and more equitable.
Yeah, we got this story like 50 years ago. Like, if we get rid of all these fusty, lumbering unions, like the economy's just gonna, you know, it's gonna explode, and we're gonna go to a lot of like inequality, but like you won't even care because like money will be just like floshing around. And we got the inequality, but we didn't get the dynamism. You know, our economy is actually slower today, productivity-wise, than it was 50 years ago when 1 in 3 workers belonged to a union. So I just think that, you know, history is kind of a solvent for this like doxa of capitalism we're often fed.
Let me bring it home for a second. Chicago's new mayor, Brandon Johnson, he actually just gave his first ever city budget address this week. Did y'all catch that? Yeah? Got all the highlights? So he calls housing a human right, and he proposed more than $250 million to go towards supporting Chicago's unhoused population through bring Chicago home, more shelters, et cetera. And I talk with housing advocates all the time on my program and just out reporting, and they say, you know, there's been so much disinvestment here in particular neighborhoods. And for folks who live here, they know where I'm talking about. There are hundreds of thousands of people still right now on the Chicago Housing Authority waiting list. About 120,000 families, 300,000 people on that list. So Johnson's really attempting to close an almost impossible decades-long gap. $250 million, they say, well, that's a great step, but it's not enough. So I want you to talk through that, because they're saying he needs state and federal backing in order to help unhoused folks find permanent housing, which is really the ultimate goal here, right? Not shelters. So What's your thoughts on either side of this argument here?
Yeah, without stable shelter, everything else falls apart.
Yeah.
And so whatever our issue is, whatever keeps us up at night, the lack of safe, affordable housing sits somewhere at the root of that issue. Unfortunately, I don't live in this great city, but nationwide, most renting families below the poverty lines spend at least half of their income on housing costs, and about 1 in 4 spend over 70% of their income just on rent and utilities. Only about 1 in 4 families nationwide who qualify for any kind of housing assistance get it. And so you're right, these waiting lists, right? They often don't reach to the years, they often reach to the decades. I've got 2 young kids back there in the green room. If I applied for public housing in some of our biggest cities today, I'd be like a grandfather by the time they came. My application came up for review. So that's the reality. And I think any deep investment in affordable housing will pay off in dividends. But where are you going to build it? And this is a word for my affluent whites in the audience, my fellow affluent whites.
Not in my backyard.
We can't let our values stop where our property line begins. And let's say you get $1 billion from the feds, pouring into Chicago. If we don't finally end segregation, if we don't finally confront that, where are you going to build it? And so I feel that the debates about housing are debates like about gentrification, for example, like Wicker Park is gentrifying. Those debates are happening because affluent white communities have been so successful keeping everyone out. Democrats are more likely to support public housing in the abstract, but they're no more likely to vote yes on affordable housing on their own neighborhoods. Recent studies show that conservative renters are more likely to vote yes on affordable housing in their own community than liberal homeowners. So maybe we're not so polarized after all. And I think that for those of us that commit ourselves to poverty abolitionism, this has to be part of it. Like, we have to go down to those zoning board meetings and stand up and tell our aldermen, look, I'm not going to endorse segregation here. I'm not going to deny other kids opportunities my kids get by living here. Build this thing. So I think that when we have these conversations about budgets, right, they can feel very far away.
Yeah.
The city council should do something. Yeah, the Congress should do something. But I want us to be a little skeptical of that. Yes, they should. But we should too, and we got to get in there too. Yeah.
Is some of that what you mean in the book by tearing down the walls?
Yeah, we can't just throw money over the walls. We have to tear down the walls. And, on most residential land, it is illegal to build anything other than a single detached family home. I do not have to talk to Chicagoans about the importance of segregation and how that can rip apart a community. And this is a critical part of the struggle. And so I think that those of us who are longing for more inclusive communities, more broad, prosperous communities, that's not just a policy change. That's like a neighbor-to-neighbor, backyard barbecue to barbecue, soccer dad to soccer dad conversation too. Segregation gets reproduced in laws and because of historical legacy, but it also gets reproduced every day, these everyday moments. And so I would like to see real action and real moral, personal action on that too.
I feel like there are a lot of people, I've been in Chicago now for 3 years and doing this work and meeting so many people every day. That's why I love my job so much, because no day is the same, right? And I get to just talk to everyday people every single day who are just like me and are surprised when I can relate to a lot of what they're talking about because, yeah, I've been through it. And a lot of what we're talking about, I've been through it. I've been, for most of my life, a single mother, right? And I think there is that desire, as you talk about neighbor to neighbor, backyard to backyard, but sometimes folks don't feel like they're being heard. I mean, they'll go to their alderman, and what does that really do sometimes? How do you hold on to hope?
Ooh, yeah. I feel like it's a choice to be hopeful or not. I feel there's a chic nihilism going on in America today, where it's cool to be hopeless. And I kind of feel like our hopelessness is pretty useless. And I feel that we have to hang on to that hope. And for me, one way to do it, and I think this connects to the beginning of your question about getting heard, is to spend a lot of time with folks that are part of the anti-poverty movement and fighting and struggling on the ground. Right before COVID, I was hanging out with this group in Minneapolis called United Renters for Justice. And they would, they'd go in front of the city council and they'd just raise a lot of hell, you know? And one day I was like, why do you guys do that? They interrupt the city council with like chants and songs and stuff. And I was like, you know, the city council is pretty sympathetic to you guys. Why are you doing this? And one of the guys is like, to show them that it's moon power, not sun power. And I was like, are you high?
What does that mean?
And,
what does that mean?
Well, that was my question. And he's like, sometimes you get, you know, on a dais, or you put a robe on, or someone puts a plaque in front of you, and you think the power comes from you, like you're the sun. And we're here to remind them that they're just the moon. You know, their power is reflecting us. I was like, oh. And so I think...
I would have been like, wait, am I high?
Somebody's high in this situation. But I think that gives me hope too.
Yeah.
You know, hanging out with folks that are making big asks and are winning, you know, and they're not Pollyannish, they're up against that. But I think that's super hopeful. So if those of you looking for some more hope in your life, I have a website for you. It's called endpovertyusa.org, and it does two things. It connects families to services in their community they need, and it's designed to connect all of us to groups like United Renters for Justice and folks in Chicago and elsewhere just putting in the work. So
say that website again.
It's endpovertyusa.org, www.endpovertyusa.org.
We don't need the www
we gotta,
anymore.
Yeah, we gotta.
It's
I'm
2023.
still analog, you know.
Giving yourself away there. Let's dig into your personal business while I have you here. You know, tell us about your own history with poverty. I love how you open the book and you say, I began paying attention to poverty as a child. Did you immediately recognize that something was wrong, or what was the fascination?
Well, I grew up in a little town in Arizona, Winslow, Arizona, like the Eagle song.
Anybody else from?
Yeah, like everybody above a certain age is like, it's going right now. And we never had any money. My dad was a preacher. We never had any money. And I think, you know, you pay attention. You know, you go out to Denny's and you order the cheapest thing. You know, you get your light shut off, your gas shut off. The bank, my family declared bankruptcy, and the bank took our home before everyone else was doing it. And yeah, I think that I think there was an education, a bit of education, and you know, I when those things happen, I blame my dad. You know?
Why?
I think a lot of us do, right? I mean, a lot of us that grew up poor, I think we just think our parents can handle it, you know? And I remember when I spent a lot of time with evicted folks in Milwaukee, they would do the same thing. They'd get evicted. They'd be paying 88% of their income on rent and get evicted and blame themselves, you know? And so it felt very familiar to me. And I'm a sociologist now, and there's a great sociologist named C. Wright Mills, and he said, you know, the job of a sociologist is to make personal problems political ones. And I just feel that's such a beautiful, liberating thing. And so part of it has been being like, nah, Dad, there's bigger game afoot. You know, there's something bigger out there. But yeah, I think it's just a real response to find the locus of the problem close to home, and then
Those early experiences shaped your career, right? And
I think so.
Your focus, your research.
I think so. I also, like, going to college was super weird. Like, you know, in Arizona, they have like this thing where if you can graduate in the top 5%, you get free tuition. So I did that. I went to college with every student loan imaginable, got some scholarships, worked all these crazy jobs to pay for college. Like, I was a telemarketer.
Yeah.
And,
I did that too.
Yeah, did you?
Yeah.
It's
and
harder than you
market
think.
research
I know. You know what's crazy about telemarketing is it works.
Yeah.
That was crazy to me.
Hardly anyone hung up on me.
I know. If you gave me
and I called during dinner.
If you give me a mom at home,
Yeah.
I got a 50-50 chance making the sale, mom at home. And So I was like, the first sale I made, I was like, are you serious? I think someone was like, okay, I'll do it. And I was like, really? Anyways, I feel like we should riff on telemarketing, just that the rest of the show should just be telemarketing.
Let's get into role play real quick.
I know. I think college is weird because so many of my classmates were rich. They looked rich to me. They were going out for sushi. I was like, what is sushi? They were driving like Jeeps, and I think that was confusing. It made me feel small, And I think that did something to me too. And then for my last book, that's when I saw poverty that I had never seen before, though.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I'm glad you went there. That's your 2016 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Evicted. It explored sort of what it's like to experience living in the depths of poverty, right? I'm curious your decision-making when it came to going in a different direction for Poverty by America.
Yeah, I for the last book, for those of you on Reddit, I lived in two very poor neighborhoods in Milwaukee and spent time with families getting evicted and went everywhere with those families. And I met grandmas living without heat in the winter, sleeping under just piles of blankets. It was pretty routine to see kids getting evicted. I remember being on this one eviction. It was like a cold spring day. And I was with the sheriff's squad. We knocked on the door. When eviction happens, the sheriff comes to your door, and there's like a team of movers ready to just throw you out. And so we knocked on the door, and we went in. This teenager opened it. We went in. They started executing the eviction, but it was confusing because there was no adult. It was just kids. And it came out that like the mom had died, and the kids had just gone and living in the house.
Wow.
And the sheriff evicted the kids. And someone called social services, and they moved all their stuff out in the rain, and the landlord changed the locks, and we're off to the next eviction.
Didn't you even talk about how eviction courts have just a lot of kids running around?
They have so many kids. Yeah, the chance of you getting evicted triple all else equal if you live with kids, actually, according to statistical models. We just threw a study out last week that showed that the Americans most likely to be threatened with eviction are kids. Between the ages of 0 and 5. That's the face of our eviction epidemics, kids. When I started that work, I was like, surely kids will shield families from eviction, but it's the opposite, exposes them to it. So this is a long way into your question, forgive me, but I think that stuff gets to you, and I think it drove this question inside of me, which is like, why? Why? Why is there so much poverty here? And I felt a little embarrassed because I'd been on this beat all of my adult life, and I felt like if someone stopped me on the street and it's like, Matt, why is there so much poverty in America, and what can we do about it? I don't know what my answer would be.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, I got you. I wrote a whole book on that. Yeah. So Toni Morrison said, she wrote the book she wanted to read, and I felt in a way I kind of wanted to read a book like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a good book. So you talk a lot in it about the importance of raising wages. And we have seen some significant wage gains over the past few years, but I feel like people may see that and still wonder, why are those wages not keeping people out of poverty? Any ideas?
Yeah, so in 2021, workers finally got like a big wage increase. The labor market was really tight. And we got this thing that economists call wage inflation. Wages go up across the board. Something else went up across the board too, which was rents. Rents went up 17% that year, which was the highest they've ever been on record. And so this is why we can't, there's no one silver bullet to poverty, ending poverty. There has to be this comprehensive plan. And if we just focus on raising wages or a UBI, those kind of floor increasing programs are going to get diluted if we don't get the ceiling under control. So there's studies, super depressing studies, that show that when cities raise the minimum wage, tenants have an easier time paying their rent for a little while, and then the market catches up to it and they dilute it. Now this is a big historical trend. Like in the 1830s, workers went on big labor strikes, and the landlords, the landed capitalists, went to their buddies. They were like, "Yo, help, the industrial capitalists went to the landlords. They were like, help us put these strikes down. And the landlord's like, no way, because you're going to raise their wage and we're going to raise the rent, And so I think that part of we talk about these things in such bloodless terms like inflation, the inflationary crisis. In Europe, they call it like the cost of living crisis, which I think is much more to the point. And so I think that if we're going to increase wages without getting control of the housing crisis, that's why people are going to feel like, they're on a hamster wheel.
Related, the Chicago City Council voted this month to eliminate the sub-minimum wage. This is for tipped workers by 2028, right? And so the idea, for folks who aren't aware, it being to phase out tips and bring those workers up to that standard minimum wage. There's mixed reaction, right? So you have people I know that I've talked to that say, first of all, I talk to restaurant owners that say, oh, I've already been doing that. Like I already got rid of the sub-minimum wage, and I pay folks all the same. This is a long time coming. This is the direction we should be going in to get folks all on a level playing field. Then you have some employers who talk about it being too costly. I talked to one server who said, I rely so much on tips, like that's my livelihood. Please don't take tips away from me. So I'm curious, Matthew, if you think that there's a valid argument on both sides, if you have thoughts on
I think what you did is right. And I think it's going to be a net benefit from folks in the service industry. Some tipped workers do better with tips, but they tend to be the more privileged tipped workers, and so they tend to be white, and they tend to work in really high industry.
Right, I think she worked at a spot in River North.
That's a fancy thing.
Sorry.
And so,
I can't hide my facial expressions.
Yeah,
I am the worst.
So like when we hear you on the radio, we could just like imagine you just like, okay, right.
Literally.
Yeah. I think ending the sub-minimum wage is a anti-poverty, is a step in the right direction. I learned researching this book, this is a vestige of slavery. I had no idea. After Reconstruction, a lot of black women went to work in restaurants, and the owners literally were like, we're not going to pay you anything. You have to rely on charity. This is where tipping comes from. And so I think that, making sure no one falls below a certain economic wage level, I think is a net benefit. Mm-hmm. Workers have been arguing for this for years, but the National Restaurant Association, the other NRA, has been like this real force, blocking that. And I think that should be telling for us.
Yeah. We've been talking a lot about policy and programs. I want to take advantage of the fact that we have a lot of people in this room and have you give some advice to the person sitting there who wants to help alleviate poverty in their neighborhood or in their region. It can be overwhelming to know where to even start.
Yeah.
What do you say?
All right, I got 5 things. I'm ready for this question.
I'm trying to help y'all.
So we can flex our influence where we are. So this is a lesson from the gay liberation movement. Like I'm a professor, so I've got a little influence on my campus, and I can be like, what are we paying our landscapers? Are we taking care of our first-generation college students? How are we treating our adjunct faculty? Wherever you are, you have a little influence in your school board or your job or your workplace, and you can flex it on behalf of the poor. Second, can we please shop and invest with a mind toward poverty? We used to talk about sin stocks. Remember that? When you're like, we're going to get out of oil. We're going to get out. I don't want my money invested in weapons. What about like exploiting companies, union busting companies? Do we care about that? And so I think that these kind of little consumer behaviors too can help us remind us too daily that we're part of this. So we can consult organizations like B Corps or Union Plus that curate a list of employers that are doing really right by their workers. So you want to mail a package, like FedEx isn't unionized, UPS is. You want to drink a beer, like Miller's unionized, a lot of other, so like I think that like we can kind of build those decisions into our consumer choices. Not because that's enough, it's not, but it is something that's part of changing the political will, and it's also just like the right thing to do. The third thing we should do is we should talk about taxes differently. So a lot of us, right, left, and center, when tax time comes around, this is how we set, this is our conversation. Oh, fuck, taxes. That's it. That's what we do. But like, what if the next time, like, your neighbor leans over the fence and is like, did you see the property tax bill? You were like, I know. I get the mortgage interest deduction for this house. This is crazy. And like, we have over 1 million public school kids that are homeless today. So this is like an insane cutout for people like me. And so I've donated that money to my local eviction defense, and I've written my congressperson saying they should wind it down for folks like me. That's an awkward conversation. That's a little awkward.
It is. It is.
That's a little awkward. But like,
Indeed.
that's how we shift the common sense. And I think we've learned this in the green movement, right? So a lot of us have been like, I want to do something about climate change. And then we'll drive down the street and we'll be like, did Cheryl put solar panels on? I think Cheryl put solar panels on. And then we'll start thinking about it. And so a lot of us has changed our diets, our air travel, or what cars we drive because of our friends and families do. And the more of us that can start flexing, our commitment to poverty abolitionism in our daily life, that can spread. That can be contagious. I have 2 more.
Yes, please. This is your show.
Let's go to zoning board meetings. We got to go to zoning board meetings. What are we teaching our kids when they plainly see us barring the doors of opportunity for other kids and doing it in their names? And then you can go to my website, inpovertyusa.org, and you can join an anti-poverty movement. Get plugged
5.
in with your time and your money. Yeah.
So I want to leave some time here for you all to ask questions. I think we've got folks with microphones here. So if you can maybe put a show of hands if you have something to ask, Matthew.
Yes, if you have a question, please raise your hand, and a staff member may be around with a microphone. We ask that you keep your questions brief and clear for ease of communication with our presenters, and try to keep commentary to a minimum, just so we can take as many questions as we can with our remaining time.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to both buying and reading your book.
It's a good book.
So you've mentioned there's an increase in poverty among people who are elderly. Is there a corresponding increase in crime among people who are elderly?
Do you say crime?
Yes.
So crime and poverty don't track with one another, actually. It's interesting, and the reason it is crime is really the result or a result of concentrated poverty. This kind of ecological network, neighborhood-based poverty, creating areas that are really criminogenic. And so this is another reason why we have to confront segregation. And I think that the crime question also gets us to recognize that, like, when we're making arguments for the end of poverty, we're also making arguments for a safer, freer, more vibrant country. This book is not a win-win book. It's a book that's really asking some of us to take less from the government. But I think what we do get from that bargain is a better place to live for us and our kids. There's this old line in the Book of Sands which goes, if you want your people to build a boat, don't assemble the wood, but make them long for the edge of the sea. And I think that part of our work in telling this new story is not just saying this is the right thing to do, but it's like this is the better thing to do for all of us.
Great, we have another question to your left here.
Hi, I work in street outreach in Chicago, and I'm very curious to see, because most of my clients live on the far south and west side, and they're not.
Take your time.
They're not a part of the census. They're not a part. They don't have the same options, So I'm very curious to hear. Sorry, I'm a very awkward person. Just kind of how that is factored into poverty, because a lot of our substance users, a lot of our folks that live on the street, a lot of our folks struggling with mental illness, they are not factored into the census. They are not factored into how that is collected. A lot of my clients don't even have a birth certificate. So I'm just curious, when we're talking about poverty, how do we talk about the folks that we deem unattractive when it comes to poverty? We don't want to think about our substance users, because that would require us to think about opening safe injection sites. We don't want to think about those struggling with mental illness, because then we would have to come to terms with how bad our health care system is. And so I'm just very curious to hear kind of your insight in that.
Yeah, thanks for your work. I think that you're right. You know, the poverty numbers that we have are very scary, but they're not as scary as they should be. You know who else isn't counted in our poverty statistics? People in prison, in jail, right? We're literally disappearing people out of the numbers because of this. By our best estimates, 5.3 million Americans live on $4 a day or less, which means they're abjectly poor by global standards. I do think that confronting the real depths upon depths of poverty is essential for this work. And I feel that this is actually changing a little bit. Mainly because the problem is getting more visible to communities where it wasn't visible before. This could go in a lot of different directions, right? We're seeing the numbers of street homelessness increase, the number of violent episodes toward the homeless increase. And it could go in a direction where we really are sympathetic and there's more of a big move, or it can go in the opposite direction. We're kind of at an inflection point now here too. But I think that what your question is signaling is the fact that America harbors this hard bottom layer of poverty that we thought only existed in faraway places of bare feet and swollen bellies. And that has to be part of our story about who we are too. And because that's our story, it signals the fact that all this poverty really belies any claim to our national greatness.
I'm right here next to her.
It's like, yes, God? Yeah.
Thank you very much for talking about those of us who have privilege need to recognize it and deal with it. One of the things that you said in the beginning about raising wages and restaurant owners, for instance, not wanting to do that, it's because we complain that the prices in the restaurants go up. We don't want to see farm workers in poverty, but when we pay them more, the cost of our food goes up and we bitch and moan. We like having the government programs to deal with poverty. We like the fact that things went down, but we're all upset about the gas prices. So I think part of it is that we have to very much individually own the fact that our cost of life will have to go up when we're privileged to allow the people who are the less well off to live better than they do. That is a personal sacrifice that we must make, otherwise it will not work. And we have to change our tax conversation, like you said, and say, the money that I'm giving to the government is my contribution to this. I want to work at making it as effective as it can be and working on the right things, but I have to stop complaining about my giving it away.
That's exactly right.
So well said.
Yeah.
And that is the book.
Yeah.
There's a lot
That's
more.
exactly right. And so I would like us to shop differently and brag about it. Reward companies and brag about it. You know, like if you walk down the streets of London, there are shops that have stickers. It's like, this shop pays a living wage. You can vote with your wallet in that regard. And I think that we have to talk about it in terms of taxes and segregation too. It's absolutely right. The thing that distinguishes the country when you look at all other advanced democracies is we collect about 25% of our GDP in taxes. In Italy, Ireland, Switzerland, Sweden, Netherlands, they collect between 35 and 38% of their GDP in taxes. And you can feel it on the ground there, right? And so I think that's the big kahuna. And it means that whenever we're faced with some like, well, like in a world of scarce resources, like, you know, like we have to be like, no, like we're choosing this like crazy thing where we're just subsidizing affluence instead of alleviating poverty, and that has to stop. So we have to like cultivate this like reflex against that pervasive like scarcity discourse too, I feel.
Looking for a sort of positive edge to this discussion. I'm wondering if there are any examples, either locally in this country or internationally, where there had been entrenched generational, decades-long, if not hundreds of years long, poverty that changed, that was, they overcame whatever issues that we have currently, and what that took for this change to take place.
Yeah, well, I feel this is a hopeful book, actually.
Yes.
I bring hope. And I feel we don't need to look very far. We could look at in the 1960s with the Great Society and the War on Poverty. So 10 years after those programs were launched, these were like deep investments in the poorest families in America. They were like making food aid permanent, establishing Head Start, Job Corps, expanding Social Security benefits. 10 years later, the poverty rate was half of what it was in 1960. It was a big difference. One of the things, though, that we should recognize about the War on Poverty and the Great Society was they weren't fighting poverty alone. That was a time when unions were strong. Real wages were going up 2% every year. The job market was delivering for workers. So it was like this great 1-2 punch, and we need that 1-2 punch again. Another example we can look at is just in COVID. In COVID, we had a different country for 2 years on this score. Like, our welfare state, it was like Belgium's or Norway's. We had a European-style welfare state, which is to say large, and we had European-style poverty numbers, which is to say small. And then we just let it go. And I feel, I'm sorry to be a broken record on this, but I feel all the easy answers for that are absolving. It wasn't just that senator from West Virginia. It was him, but it wasn't just him. It wasn't just temporary. Look at World War II. World War II was temporary, and we got the New Deal. It just fundamentally changed the course of society. So it wasn't just temporary aid, and it wasn't just this party or that one person. It was also us. And I feel like we might get another shot, and maybe we won't blow it next time.
Another question toward the back to your left here.
Yeah, hi, how are you doing? I'm an international student, and one thing I want to ask, or two things. Firstly, is how unique is the American poverty situation? Because we see from China, they're subsidizing a lot of their people to get housing, like you talked about. So I want to firstly ask that. And is there any cultural significance to it? A lot of Americans love to live in, suburban households. Does America have to change their kind of cultural thinking about it?
That's a great question.
I feel out of my depths doing the US-China comparison. The US is unique when it comes to looking at other advanced democracies of the West. And the uniqueness comes with the depth and expanse of our poverty rate. And so it's not to say there isn't poverty elsewhere, but there isn't a country this rich that has this much poverty. I think that's one of the big key differences that sets us apart. We're kind of in a class on our own on that kind of distinction, this like private opulence, public poverty. On the cultural question, I struggle with this question. I'm a little skeptical of what we believe or what we want or like. You guys ever read that book, Propaganda? It was like what Mad Men is based on. The opening sentence of Propaganda is like, you guys think you have beliefs, but we control those beliefs.
Oh my gosh.
And I think that there's a lot of stories and myths about poverty in America, but I tend to see those as propaganda, like what Hannah Arendt called propaganda. Things that we don't necessarily believe, but they organize us. They shut down conversation. And I think the beliefs on poverty are actually quite complicated in the United States. I don't know how many of us do like living in suburban communities, but it's kind of like a good option we have, I've lived in those communities, and I've lived in very poor communities. I'm not romantic about my time in poor communities, but I'll tell you what, I've never experienced neighborliness and generosity like I did when I lived in poor communities.
Absolutely.
And so I think that another part of arguing for integration and for opening up of our communities isn't just a service to those left out of the wall. It's about the spiritual poverty that a lot of Americans are facing with the stingy, scared affluence that we've accepted.
We have time for one more question.
Right over here on your right. Hi, thank you very much. Full disclosure, I too am a sociologist, and I'm struck by the fact that today, while we were talking about poverty, the intersectionality of race, gender, and ethnicity was not mentioned. And I'd like you to sort of address that in this notion of talking about poverty.
Well, it's impossible to write a book called Poverty by America without also writing a book that is about racism in America.
It's all through there. That's for
It's
sure.
a through line. And so when we're talking about integration, we're talking about racism, specifically anti-black racism. When we're talking about a skinny welfare state, we're often talking about the fact of white resistance to the welfare state because they think it'll be disproportionately going to black folks. So I think that you're right. This is a crucial part of the story. If you look just at housing, right, you have to confront the fact that most white folks in America are homeowners, and housing kind of works for us. Most Black and Latinx families in America are renters and are exposed to rent hikes and the eviction crisis because of our systematic dispossession of people from the land. So I think the movement against racism and the movement against poverty have a lot of solidarity between those two movements.
Thank you all so much. Your questions were so thoughtful
they
and
were
insightful.
great.
Thank you for being here, and join me, please, in thanking Matthew Desmond.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you so much.